I was sitting in a hospital hallway with a phone in my hand doing the math for the fourth time, praying the numbers would change. They never did. My daughter needed a surgery that couldn't wait another day, and I was $3,600 short. So I called the one man in the world who could write that check without blinking, my own father. He picked up laughing about a deal he'd just closed. $11 million, he said, like he was daring me to be impressed. And when I finally asked for help, he told me I wasn't worth a single dollar of it. My name is Isabella Jenkins. I'm 38 years old, a captain in the United States Army, closing in on 17 years of service. I've jumped out of airplanes. I've stood in rooms where the wrong decision costs lives. I thought I knew what fear felt like until I sat in that plastic chair outside the cardiac unit at Walter Reed, listening to my 8-year-old daughter's heart monitor beep through the wall, and realized that all my training meant nothing when the enemy was a number on a hospital invoice. Emma was born with a heart that never quite finished forming right. We'd managed it for years with medication, with checkups, with a kind of careful optimism that let us live normal lives in between the scary parts. But 2 weeks ago, the cardiologist sat me down with that particular gentleness doctors use right before they tell you something is worse than you hoped, and said the valve couldn't wait any longer. Surgery, now. And the number attached to it even after insurance. Even after everything the Army covered left a gap of $3,600 standing between my daughter and an operating table. I want you to understand something about me before I go further. I don't ask for help. I was raised, if you can call it that, to believe that asking meant weakness, and weakness meant you didn't belong in this family. So when I tell you I sold my car, when I tell you I emptied a savings account I'd been building since my first deployment, when I tell you I called in favors from soldiers I served with 15 years ago, understand that every single one of those calls cost me something. Pride is expensive when you're broke. Still, $3,600 sat there like a wall I couldn't climb. I told myself I wouldn't call him. I'd promised myself that a long time ago, somewhere around the 5th birthday of mine, he didn't show up for, or maybe the 12th, I honestly lost count. But Emma was 3 days from surgery, and I was out of proud options, so I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage and dialed my father's number for the first time in almost 2 years. He picked up on the 4th ring, and I could hear him before I could even get a full sentence out, that booming, self-satisfied voice, mid-conversation with someone else, waving me off like an interruption. Hold on, he said to whoever was in the room with him. Then to me, Isabella, this is a surprise. I kept it simple. I didn't ask for a gift. I didn't ask for an inheritance I knew I'd never see. I asked for a loan, $3,600, whatever terms he wanted, I'd sign anything. I told him it was for Emma's heart surgery. There was a pause, and for one stupid, hopeful second I thought maybe something in him would soften. Instead, he laughed. Not a cruel laugh, exactly worse, an amused one, like I'd told a joke he didn't expect from me. "Do you know what I did this morning?" he said. "I closed an $11 million deal, 11 million, Isabella, before 10 a.m. He said it the way other men might mention the weather, except he wanted me to feel the weight of it, wanted me to understand exactly how far beneath that number I was standing. I told him I wasn't asking about his deal, I was asking about his granddaughter. "You'll get nothing from me," he said, and his voice went cold in that particular way I remembered from childhood, the tone that meant the conversation was already over in his mind. "My money goes to people who understand family, who show up, who don't disappear for years and then call when they need something." I wanted to remind him who disappeared first. I wanted to remind him that I was 19 years old at my own mother's funeral while he was already introducing us to Carol. But I didn't have the strength for that fight, not that day, not with Emma's surgery hanging over everything. So I just sat there, phone pressed to my ear, saying nothing while my father hung up on me without another word. I remember staring at the phone afterward like it might ring again, like there was some version of this where he called back and apologized. It didn't ring. The garage was quiet except for the hum of the fluorescent lights, and I sat there feeling something crack open in my chest that I'd spent years keeping sealed shut. That's when I heard a knock on my window. It was Aunt Margaret, my mother's younger sister, 63 years old, living on a fixed income that barely covered her own bills, standing outside my car in a windbreaker that had seen better winters, holding an envelope in both hands, like it was something sacred. I rolled the window down, and before I could say anything, she pushed it into my lap. "It's not much," she said, "but it's what I have." Inside were $3,000 in cash and a worn cashier's check money. I later learned she'd been saving for a new roof money she'd pulled from an account she'd built one careful deposit at a time for years. I looked up at her, and I couldn't speak. I just cried right there in the parking garage in a way I hadn't let myself cry in front of anyone since I was a little girl. That was the day I understood something that would change how I saw my entire family. The richest man I knew had just told me I wasn't worth a dime, and the poorest woman I knew had just handed me almost everything she had without me even asking. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at Margaret's kitchen table with the envelope of cash in front of me, and I asked her the question I'd never had the courage to ask growing up: why did she stay when nobody else did? She poured herself tea she didn't drink, and told me the story from the beginning, the way you'd finally open a door you'd kept locked out of kindness for someone else. My mother, her older sister, died of ovarian cancer when I was 19. I remember the funeral in pieces, the smell of lilies, the sound of my own shoes on the church floor, my father standing at the podium giving a eulogy that sounded like it belonged to a stranger. What I didn't fully register at the time, because grief has a way of blurring the edges of everything, was how fast life moved on for him afterward. Margaret told me Robert was engaged to Carol within 8 months, married within 14. She said it like she was reporting a fact she'd made peace with a long time ago, but I could hear something underneath it, something that had never quite healed. "Your mother wasn't even cold in the ground," she said, "and he was already picking out furniture for a new house." Nathan was born less than 2 years after that, and from what Margaret described, my father found in that new family something he decided he preferred: a wife who managed him rather than challenged him. A son he could mold from scratch without the complication of grief attached to him. I was the leftover piece from a life he seemed to want to file away. Margaret was the one who showed up instead. She drove me to school when Carol claimed she had appointments. She sat in the bleachers at my track meets when my father was closing deals. She was the one who stood in the crowd at my commissioning ceremony the day I became an officer, crying harder than I did while my father sent a card 2 weeks late with a check inside instead of himself. "I asked him, you know," Margaret said, and her voice thinned out in a way I'd never heard before. "More than once. I told him, Robert, that girl needs her father, not his money." He'd get quiet for a second like it landed somewhere, and then he'd change the subject, every single time. I asked her why she never told me this before, why she let me spend 2 decades hoping he'd change, hoping the next holiday or the next phone call would be different. She looked at me with an expression I can only describe as tired love. "Because you needed to believe in something," she said. "And I didn't want to be the one who took that from you. Some things people have to lose on their own timeline." I held the envelope again, feeling the weight of it differently now. Margaret told me those $3,000 had been set aside for her roof, which had been leaking since the spring, patched twice already with tarps and prayers. She said it without any performance of sacrifice, no expectation that I'd protest or refuse it, just a plain statement of fact, the way you'd mention you'd given someone your umbrella in the rain. I told her I couldn't take it, that I'd find another way, that her roof mattered too. She took my hands in both of hers, and her grip was stronger than I expected from someone her age. "Emma is my great-niece," she said. "The roof can wait. Hearts can't." That night, still $200 short, even with Margaret's gift stacked on top of everything else I'd scraped together, I lay awake running numbers in my head like calculating rounds of ammunition, trying to find $600 more somewhere in a life that had already been wrung dry. I decided somewhere around 3 in the morning that it didn't matter. Emma's surgery was happening regardless. I would find a way to cover the gap, even if it meant selling the ring my mother left me, the only thing of hers I had left. I didn't have to. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a notification from my old unit's family readiness group. A wire transfer, $600 exactly, sent by Master Sergeant Daniels, a man I'd served 2 tours with, someone who'd carried me on his back for 4 miles during a training exercise gone wrong, and never once brought it up afterward like it was a debt owed. The message attached read simply, "Heard about Emma, get her fixed, pay it forward someday." No fanfare, no expectation of thanks. Just a soldier taking care of another soldier's family the way we're trained to, the way that actually means something. I called him crying and he brushed it off the way men like him always do, told me to focus on my daughter and not worry about anything else. I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet of Margaret's guest room, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel in the middle of all this fear. A strange, aching gratitude, not for what my father had, but for what the people around me were willing to give even when they had so much less. The next afternoon I signed the final paperwork at the hospital admissions desk, every dollar accounted for. Every gap closed not by blood, but by people who'd chosen to love me anyway. I remember watching the nurse wheel Emma's bed toward the operating room doors, her small hand gripping a stuffed rabbit I'd bought her the day she was born. And I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me even then, that whatever happened next, I already knew who my real family was. It wasn't the man who'd bragged about $11 million. It was the woman who'd handed me her last $3,000 without a single condition attached. The waiting room outside a pediatric cardiac unit has its own particular silence. It isn't peaceful. It's the silence of people holding their breath collectively, pretending to read magazines they aren't reading, checking phones for messages that won't come until the surgeon walks through those double doors. I sat there for 6 hours with Margaret's hand wrapped around mine, and somewhere around hour 4 I stopped being able to feel my own fingers. Not from circulation, but from how hard I was gripping her. When Dr. Alvarez finally came through those doors, still in scrubs mask pulled down around her neck, I read her face before she said a single word, and something in me finally allowed itself to unclench. "She did great," the doctor said. "Better than great. The valve repair went exactly the way we hoped. She's going to have a strong heart, Captain Jenkins." I don't remember standing up. I don't remember crossing the room. I just remember Margaret's arms around me and both of us crying in a way that had nothing to do with sadness anymore, the kind of crying that empties you out and fills you back up at the same time. Emma woke up groggy that evening, blinking against the recovery room lights, and the first thing she asked for wasn't me, it was her stuffed rabbit, which told me everything I needed to know about how much of her spirit had survived that operating table intact. I sat by her bed until she fell back asleep, watching the steady, strong rhythm on the monitor, a rhythm that no longer had that dangerous flutter underneath it. For the first time in weeks, I let myself believe the worst part was over. I was wrong about that, but not in the way you'd expect. The next morning, while Emma was still sleeping off the anesthesia, my father walked into the hospital. I want to be clear that some small, foolish part of me hoped even then, even after everything, that he'd come to see his granddaughter. That maybe the surgery had shaken something loose in him, some dormant sense of family he'd buried under decades of ambition. That hope lasted exactly as long as it took him to open his mouth. "Where's Margaret?" He said not even a hello, not even a glance toward Emma's room down the hall. I told him she'd stepped out to get coffee and asked what this was about. He informed me in the clipped tone of a man delivering a business memo rather than speaking to his own daughter that Margaret had taken money that belonged to the family, and he expected it returned. Immediately. In full. I stared at him, genuinely trying to understand if I'd misheard. "That was her own money," I said. "Her savings. She gave it to me for Emma's surgery." "It's family money," he said, as though the phrase explained everything, as though blood created some kind of collective account he could withdraw from at will while contributing nothing to it himself. "And besides, it's inappropriate. She's manipulating you, using your situation to feel important, to insert herself where she doesn't belong." Right on cue, Carol appeared behind him in the hallway, arms crossed, wearing the particular expression of satisfaction she always got when there was family conflict to stir. "We all saw this coming," she said to no one in particular, loud enough to make sure I heard it. "Margaret's always wanted to play the martyr, probably feels important swooping in like some kind of savior." Nathan trailed in a few steps behind her, phone in hand, barely looking up. "Yeah, don't let her fool you," he said, that lazy, condescending drawl he'd perfected over the years. "She's not a hero. She's just bored and broke and wants attention." Something in me, something that had stayed quiet through years of exactly this kind of treatment, finally refused to stay quiet anymore. I felt it rise up through my chest like heat steady, and controlled the way I'd trained myself to be under actual fire, and I stepped between my father and the hallway leading to Emma's room. That woman, I said, my voice low but absolutely unshaking. Sat with me every single day of my childhood that none of you bothered to show up for. She gave me the money that saved my daughter's life while you were bragging about $11 million. So no, nobody is getting that money back. And nobody in this family is setting foot near my daughter's room again unless I say otherwise. The hallway went quiet in a way I'd never experienced with my father before. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that, especially not by me, and I watched something flicker across his face. Not shame exactly, but a kind of startled recalculation, like he was seeing a version of me he hadn't accounted for. He recovered quickly, falling back on anger the way he always did when he lost control of a room. "You'll regret this," he said, jabbing a finger toward me. "All of you will regret this." Carol tugged at his sleeve, already turning to leave, muttering something about how ungrateful I'd always been. Nathan just shook his head and followed without another word, already back to scrolling his phone before he'd even reached the elevator. I stood in that hallway long after they'd gone, my heart pounding, my hands trembling slightly with the adrenaline of having finally said out loud what I'd swallowed for 20 years. Margaret came back a few minutes later, with 2 cups of vending machine coffee, and immediately knew something had happened from the look on my face. I told her everything. She didn't get angry. She didn't even look particularly surprised. She just handed me one of the coffees and said quietly, "He's been threatening people his whole life, Isabella. It's the only tool he's ever really had." Then she looked toward Emma's door, and something steadier settled into her expression. "But we're not the ones who should be scared right now." I didn't fully understand what she meant by that until a few weeks later when she brought me an old wooden box that would change everything I thought I knew about my mother, my father, and the 20 years of silence sitting between us. Emma was home recovering, sleeping 10 hours a night the way growing children do after their bodies have been through something enormous, and I finally had a few quiet evenings to breathe. That's when Margaret showed up at my door carrying a wooden box. I didn't recognize its corners, worn soft with age, a small brass latch tarnished green at the edges. "This was your mother's," she said, setting it on my kitchen table like it might still be fragile after all these years. "I've kept it since the funeral. I always meant to give it to you when you were ready. I think you're ready now." Inside were letters, bank statements, yellowed at the folds photographs of my mother, as a young woman I barely recognized, laughing in a way I only vaguely remembered from early childhood before illness had worn that laughter down. And near the bottom, folded in thirds inside a plain envelope, a handwritten document with my mother's careful looping signature at the bottom. A will, not the official one that had been read after her death, the one that left everything to my father to manage on my behalf, until I turned 25. This was different, a personal letter alongside a separate handwritten note describing an investment account she'd opened in my name years before she got sick, money from her own inheritance, money she'd wanted to keep separate and protected for me specifically. I read it twice then, a third time, my hands going cold. According to this document, that account should have held a substantial sum by the time I turned 25. When I asked my father about it years ago, back when I was young and naive enough to still ask him things directly, he told me the account had been lost in a bad investment, that the market had wiped it out, that he was sorry, but there was nothing left. I remember believing him. I remember apologizing to him for even asking. Margaret watched my face as I put the pieces together, and I could tell she'd known some version of this for a long time, carrying it the way she carried everything painful in this family, quietly, protectively waiting for the right moment. "I always wondered," she admitted. "Your mother told me about that account before she got sick. She was proud of it, proud that you'd have something that was truly yours, something Robert couldn't touch or take credit for. When she died, and you never mentioned it, I assumed it had just disappeared the way your father said. I didn't have proof of anything until she gave me this box years later, telling me to hold on to it for you. I spent the next several nights barely sleeping, going through old bank statements Margaret had also saved, cross-referencing dates, and what I found made my stomach turn in a way physical pain never had. There were transfer records, faded but legible, showing that account being moved, not lost, not devalued by some unfortunate market crash, but transferred directly into a holding entity connected to my father's real estate company. 21 years ago, right around the time he'd built the second wing of his business headquarters. I brought everything to a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Reyes, who specialized in estate and financial fraud, someone Margaret had actually found through a support group for elder financial abuse survivors, which told me something about how many families dealt with exactly this kind of betrayal. Patricia went through the documents with the careful, unhurried patience of someone who'd seen this pattern before, and after almost 2 hours of review, she looked up at me with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and quiet professional certainty. "This isn't just a family disagreement," she said. "This looks like a documented pattern of misappropriation. If these transfer records are authentic, and they appear to be your father moved funds that were legally designated for you into his own business under circumstances that would be very difficult to explain innocently." She didn't stop there. Digging further into public financial filings, she found something else, an old life insurance policy taken out on my mother, one I'd never known existed with a payout that had also somehow been absorbed into my father's business finances, rather than distributed according to the policy's actual beneficiary designation, which listed me as a secondary recipient upon reaching adulthood. I sat in that lawyer's office feeling something shift permanently inside me. This wasn't about the $11 million he'd bragged about on the phone. This wasn't even really about the money at all, not fundamentally. It was about 20 years of being told I wasn't valued enough to matter, while the entire time the truth was that I'd been valued enough to steal from. Patricia leaned forward slightly, her voice gentler now. "You have real grounds here, Isabella. If you want to pursue this, we can. It won't be quick, and it won't be easy, especially against someone with his resources. But the paper trail is strong. I thought about Emma sleeping safely in the next room because of a nurse's compassion, an army sergeant's loyalty, and an aunt's last $3,000. I thought about my mother's careful handwriting setting aside something just for me, something she believed would protect me long after she was gone. I thought about my father's voice on the phone laughing about $11 million, while his own granddaughter's heart surgery hung in the balance of $3,600. Yes, I told Patricia, I want to pursue this, not for the money, for the truth. She nodded slowly, already reaching for a fresh legal pad. Then let's build the case. Word travels fast in families like mine, even when you try to keep things quiet. Within 2 weeks of Patricia formally sending my father a letter outlining our findings and requesting records, Robert knew exactly what was coming. And true to form, he decided the best defense was open contempt. He called me directly this time, something he hadn't done in years, without Carol or Nathan hovering in the background feeding him lines. His voice had that particular swagger men get when they've never once faced real consequences, and genuinely believe that pattern will hold forever. "You think you can afford to fight me," he said, not even bothering with a greeting. "I have lawyers who bill more per hour than you make in a week. You'll bankrupt yourself before this ever sees a courtroom." I let him finish. I'd learned a long time ago in the Army that the person who needs to fill every silence with noise is usually the one most afraid of what that silence might reveal. "I appreciate the concern," I said evenly, "but I think you'll find I have more support than you're expecting." He laughed and hung up the way he always did when he wanted the last word without risking an actual response. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this fight had already stopped being just mine. Word had reached my old unit the way it does in military circles, where loyalty runs deeper than most civilians understand. Master Sergeant Daniels, the same man who'd wired $600 without hesitation, connected me with a Veterans Legal Assistance Fund, an organization that specifically helped service members and their families navigate financial exploitation cases, especially ones involving elderly relatives or family fraud. They agreed to cover a significant portion of the legal costs, treating my case as exactly the kind of injustice they existed to fight. A retired Army JAG officer, Colonel Whitfield, a woman who'd mentored me early in my career and never fully let go of that role, even after she retired, offered to consult on the case pro bono, reviewing every document Patricia's team assembled with the same exacting standard she'd once applied to courts martial. And an old friend of my mother's, a woman named Dolores, who'd worked alongside her decades earlier. came forward with something I hadn't even known to look for: old correspondence between her and my mother, discussing that very investment account, discussing my mother's specific wishes for it, written years before her illness, in her own hand, dated and clear. Piece by piece, the case built itself into something far sturdier than my father imagined possible. Carol, meanwhile, had been busy doing what Carol always did best, spreading her own version of events to anyone who'd listen. I heard through distant relatives that she'd been telling people I was only after Robert's money, now that I'd realized $11 million was on the table, that grief and desperation had turned me greedy, that Margaret had poisoned me against my own father for her own selfish reasons. It stung hearing that, even secondhand. But it also clarified something for me. This had never really been about greed, not for 1 second, and hearing myself accused of it only sharpened my resolve to make sure the truth came out clean and complete, with no room left for anyone to twist it into something ugly. Nathan, for his part, seemed to treat the entire situation as an inconvenience rather than a crisis, texting me periodically with messages that ranged from dismissive to outright cruel. "Hope this makes you feel better about yourself," one read. Another simply said, "Dad built everything from nothing. You want to tear it down over some old paperwork." I didn't respond to any of them. I was saving my energy for people who actually mattered. As Patricia's investigation deepened, something else emerged that none of us had anticipated. In tracing the movement of my mother's original investment funds through my father's business records, her forensic accountant noticed irregularities that extended beyond just my situation. Transactions involving trust accounts set up for Nathan as well, money that should have been growing steadily over the years, but showed strange gaps, withdrawals that didn't match any documented business expense, patterns that suggested my father had been treating every family trust as a personal slush fund whenever his real estate ventures needed quick liquidity. I felt something complicated when Patricia told me this. Not satisfaction exactly, because Nathan's blindness to all of it, his years of casual cruelty toward me, hadn't earned my sympathy. But there was a strange, sad recognition in realizing that even the golden child, even the son who'd received every ounce of attention and preference I'd been denied, had ultimately been just another asset in my father's ledger, valued only as long as he served a purpose. Robert, for all his bluster, started making mistakes as the pressure mounted. He fired his longtime accountant abruptly, a woman named Rosa Delgado, who'd worked for him for nearly 15 years, apparently trying to cut off a potential witness before she could be subpoenaed. It backfired spectacularly. Rosa, feeling betrayed after over a decade of loyal service tossed aside without explanation, reached out to Patricia's office herself, offering to testify about financial practices she'd been quietly uncomfortable with for years, but had been too afraid to report while still employed. By the time the mediation date was set, my father's carefully constructed image of invincibility had started to crack in places even Carol couldn't smooth over with rumors and deflection. He still walked into that first mediation session with his chin high, still radiating the confidence of a man who'd never once lost a fight he cared about. But for the first time in my entire life, I walked in beside him, not as the daughter asking for scraps, but as someone holding a truth he could no longer control. The mediation room was smaller than I expected, all beige walls and a long conference table, the kind of sterile space designed to strip emotion out of decisions that were in this case entirely made of emotion. My father walked in, wearing his best suit, the one he reserved for closing big deals, and I understood immediately that he still believed this was a negotiation he could win through sheer presence alone, the way he'd won every argument in this family for as long as I could remember. He sat across from me with Carol beside him, and his own attorney, a sharp young man named Foster, who kept glancing at his phone like he had somewhere more important to be. Patricia sat beside me, calm and unhurried, with a folder in front of her that I knew contained the accumulated weight of months of work. Robert opened with confidence, addressing the mediator directly rather than looking at me. "This is a family disagreement that's gotten blown wildly out of proportion," he said. "My daughter is grieving emotional and unfortunately being influenced by people who don't have her best interests at heart." Patricia let him finish completely before she opened her folder. She didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. She simply began laying out documents one at a time, methodically, the way you'd deal cards in a game where you already knew you held the winning hand. Bank transfer records showing my mother's investment account moving into his company's holdings 21 years ago. The insurance policy documentation with my name listed as secondary beneficiary, funds that had never been distributed as required. Rosa Delgado's signed statement detailing years of financial irregularities she'd witnessed as his accountant patterns. She said she'd raised concerns about internally more than once, only to be told to keep the numbers flexible. I watched my father's face change with each document, watched the confidence drain out slowly the way water leaves a cracked vessel. Not all at once, but steadily, inevitably. He tried to interject a few times, tried the old tactics, calling the documents misunderstandings, calling Rosa disgruntled and unreliable. But Patricia had anticipated every deflection, and each time she simply produced another piece of corroborating evidence until his objections started sounding less like defense and more like desperation. Then Margaret was called in. I hadn't expected this to be as hard for her as it clearly was. She'd agreed to testify to formally put on record everything she'd told me privately over these past months. But watching her walk into that room, watching her hands shake slightly as she took her seat, I realized how much courage this actually required from a woman who'd spent her entire adult life staying quietly in the background, never wanting to make waves, never wanting to be the center of any conflict. She spoke steadily despite the nerves describing decades of watching Robert dismiss and neglect his own daughter while building an entirely separate favored life with Carol and Nathan. She described specific conversations, specific dates, specific moments where she'd pleaded with him to show up for me and been rebuffed. She described finding the wooden box among my mother's things years earlier, understanding even then that something wasn't right about how that investment account had simply vanished, and choosing out of fear of confrontation to wait until she felt the moment was right to bring it forward. "I should have said something sooner," Margaret told the room, her voice cracking slightly. "I let fear keep me quiet for too long. I won't do that again." Robert's attorney tried one final move, attempting to paint Margaret's testimony as biased, motivated by old family resentment rather than fact. But the paper trail didn't care about motivation. Documents don't hold grudges. Bank statements don't have feelings. And every single record Patricia laid on that table told the same consistent story, regardless of who was speaking. Somewhere in the middle of all this, Nathan's own attorney, because it turned out Nathan had quietly hired someone. The moment he learned his trust fund was also under scrutiny, requested a brief recess to review new information that had just been provided regarding his own accounts. I watched Nathan's face during that request, watched the casual arrogance he'd worn through this entire process finally slip, replaced by something closer to genuine alarm. For the first time, I think, he understood that our father's carelessness with money hadn't been reserved just for me. It had simply been a matter of time before it touched him too. Carol tried to excuse herself during the recess, claiming a headache, moving toward the door with the kind of urgency that suggested she wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Robert's attorney asked her to stay, reminding her that her name appeared on several of the business accounts in question as well, and I watched her sit back down slowly, all her earlier confidence evaporating. When the mediation resumed, my father sat quieter than I'd ever seen him. He wasn't preparing his next attack anymore. He was simply absorbing the reality that had finally caught up to him, the reality that no amount of charm money or intimidation could argue away 20 years of paper trails. I watched him glance toward me at one point, something unreadable passing across his face. And for just a moment I thought I saw something that might have been closer to recognition than anger. A dawning, uncomfortable understanding that the daughter he'd dismissed as ungrateful and undeserving had actually been the one constant. The one person in this entire family who'd never once tried to take something from him that wasn't rightfully hers. Everyone else in that room, it turned out, had been circling his money for years. I had only ever wanted the truth. By the end of that session, it was clear there would be no simple, quiet resolution. The evidence was too extensive, the implications too serious, the involved parties too numerous. Robert's attorney requested time to discuss settlement terms rather than proceed toward a full trial, a request that told me everything about how this was actually going to end. Margaret rode home with me that evening in near silence, both of us emotionally wrung out in a way neither of us fully had words for yet. Somewhere near my apartment, she finally spoke. "I think," she said quietly, watching the streetlights pass outside the window, "that today was the first day your father ever really saw you." I didn't answer right away. I was thinking about Emma asleep at home with a babysitter, her heart beating strong and steady in her chest because of people who'd shown up for her without hesitation. I was thinking about how strange it was that it had taken losing almost everything to finally understand who actually mattered. 3 days after that mediation session, my father showed up at my apartment unannounced. I remember opening the door and seeing him standing there in the evening light, and for one strange second I almost didn't recognize him. He looked smaller somehow, not physically but in some deeper way, like a man who'd spent his whole life standing on a foundation that had just been proven hollow. He wasn't there to apologize. I understood that within the first 10 seconds, watching his jaw set in that familiar, stubborn way. He wanted Margaret to retract her testimony. He wanted me to drop the case before it went any further, before the settlement terms became public record, before his name got attached to words like misappropriation in any official capacity that might follow him into every future business deal. "You're destroying everything I built," he said, standing in my doorway, his voice raised just enough to carry down the hallway. "For what, some old paperwork money that's already spent?" I could have raised my voice back. There was a time, not so long ago, when I would have. But I'd spent the last several months learning something important about the difference between reacting and responding, and I chose the second one now. "You're not here because you're worried about paperwork," I told him, standing steady in my own doorway. "You're here because for the first time in your life, someone finally has proof of what you've always known was true." He started to argue, started to reach for the old script he'd relied on for decades, but I held up a hand, and something in that gesture, or maybe in my face, actually stopped him. "I'm not here to fight with you anymore," I said. "I'm done fighting for your approval. I just want to give you something." I handed him an envelope I'd prepared the night before, half expecting this visit or one like it. Inside was a cashier's check for $3,000 made out in Margaret's name money I'd repaid to her myself from my own savings the moment the first pieces of the settlement had come through. Alongside the check was a short letter I'd written only a few lines, but every word of it had cost me something to put down on paper. The letter told him that, as of that day, I no longer owed him anything. Not gratitude, not loyalty, not the decades of hoping he'd finally choose to be a father instead of a landlord managing an inconvenient tenant. I told him the debt, whatever version of it he believed existed between us, was closed. I also handed him a photograph. It was Emma, taken the day after her surgery, small and pale against the hospital pillows, but smiling anyway, that stubborn, resilient smile she'd apparently inherited from someone in this family after all, even if it wasn't from him. On the back I'd written a single line, "She's alive, not because of you." I watched my father's hands shake slightly as he read the letter, as he looked at that photograph. And then, for the first time in my entire life, I watched him cry. Not the performative frustration I'd seen so many times growing up, the anger dressed up as disappointment. This was something quieter and more real, a grief I think had been buried under decades of ambition finally surfacing, now that there was nothing left to distract him from it. "I didn't know how to do this," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Any of it. Being a father. I told myself money would be enough. Maybe, once years ago, some version of me would have stepped forward at those words, would have reached for reconciliation the way I'd reached for it so many times before, only to have it slip away again. But I'd learned painfully and slowly that some apologies arrive too late to undo what they're apologizing for. I told him gently but without hesitation that I hoped he found peace with all of it eventually. Then I closed the door. The months that followed brought a kind of resolution none of us could have predicted at the start of all this. The settlement required my father to liquidate significant portions of his real estate holdings to cover the restitution owed not just to me, but to Nathan's improperly managed trust as well, and to cover the legal costs of the extensive investigation Rosa Delgado's testimony had helped uncover. Nathan humiliated and financially exposed in ways he'd never anticipated. Quietly resigned from the family company and moved to another state, and I haven't heard from him since. Carol filed for divorce less than 4 months later, taking whatever she could salvage before what remained of my father's empire finished collapsing entirely. Margaret moved in with Emma and me that fall. She sold her old house, the one with the roof she'd never gotten around to fixing, because she'd given that money to save my daughter instead, and used the proceeds to help us find a bigger place together, one with a guest room that quickly became hers, filled with her books and her tea collection, and photographs of my mother she'd kept safe for over 20 years, finally displayed openly instead of hidden away in a wooden box. Emma recovered fully. Her cardiologist cleared her for regular activity within 6 months, and now she runs around our backyard with an energy that still sometimes takes my breath away, considering how fragile her heart once seemed. She calls Margaret Grandma Maggie, and I've never once corrected her because as far as I'm concerned, that title was earned many times over in ways that had nothing to do with blood. Looking back now, I think about that day in the parking garage, phone in my hand, $3,600, standing between my daughter and the surgery that would save her life. I remember believing in that moment that I'd just lost my father completely, that whatever thin thread had still connected us had finally snapped for good. What I didn't understand yet was that I hadn't lost a family that day. I'd found one. It just wasn't the one I'd spent my whole life trying to earn a place in. It was the one that had been quietly standing beside me the entire time, waiting for me to finally stop looking in the wrong direction. Sometimes the person who gives you the most in this life is the one who has the least to give. And sometimes the family you're born into isn't the family that actually saves you. If this story moved you even a little, I'd love to hear where you're watching from tonight. Drop a comment below and let me know. Sometimes just knowing someone out there understood makes all of this worth telling. We share stories like this one every single day, real moments about family forgiveness and the people who show up when it matters most. So if you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and subscribe. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. Let's keep going on this journey together.